I think it's important for most portrait photographers to understand how flash photography works. Even if you prefer to use natural light, there are going to be times when you need to work with flash. In this Flash Photography for Portraits crash course, I'm going to go over all the important things you'll need to know to get started. And by the time you reach the end of this video, you'll know all about the different gear options, flash synchronization, lighting modifiers, how to take advantage of TTL and manual flash. You'll learn about exposure settings, portrait lighting patterns, and we'll cover key lighting, fill lighting, and multi-light setups. There's a lot to learn, but stick with it all the way through, and you'll really be ready to take on flash portraits like a pro. We'll talk about the gear you'll need, but what might be most important right now is to have a camera that has a standard flash hot shoe and is capable of manual exposure settings. Most decent semi-pro cameras will have everything you need in terms of features. You'll also need at least one flash and a flash trigger, but we'll get to that as we progress through the video. Some of the topics like TTL I'll mention early in the video, and then we'll go into more detail on those topics later on. Also, don't forget to check out the links in the description for my free photography guide downloads and other resources that will help you quickly grow your photography skills. Okay, let's get right to it. For the purposes of this course, and for most portraiture, there are two types of flash that we're going to be concerned with: shoe mount or speedlight flash units and larger flash units and strobes. Shoe mount units, otherwise known as speedlights, are small flash units that are designed to fit on a flash accessory shoe or on the hot shoe of your camera. Now, these shoe mount flash units are widely used and widely available. They're available as budget-priced third-party flashes, and of course you can purchase the premium-priced versions too. Even though these are relatively small and don't look like, big, serious studio strobes, they're still used by photographers at all levels, even professionals. Larger flash units would be the type that don't fit onto the hot shoe of the camera, and depending on the unit, they emit more light than regular speedlights, as do studio strobes. All of these, of course, come in different sizes and are capable of varying degrees of light output. Now let's go ahead and start with shoe mount or speedlight flash units. And these are basically the types of flash units that are made to fit on top of the camera. They're light and compact. They're not as powerful as larger studio strobes, but they're still very capable for portraiture. Also, most of these operate on standard AA batteries, usually 4 batteries at a time. You'll get at least a couple hundred shots out of a good set of batteries. Now, I usually like to use rechargeable batteries because they seem to last a little longer, and over time, they can save you a lot of money on battery purchases. These smaller flash units will generally give you a pretty good recycle time for flash. And by recycle time, I mean the time it takes between flashes for the flash to recharge and be ready to fire fully for the next shot. Like I said before, these can be mounted directly to a camera's hot shoe. Many have flash heads that tilt and rotate, which can be very useful, especially if you're using your flash attached directly to your camera's hot shoe. Because if you're using a flash in that configuration, you don't always want to hit your subject directly with that flash from the camera position. That's generally an unflattering look. But with the tilt and rotate feature, you can turn the flash head away from your subject and maybe, direct the light at a wall to one side of the subject, or even point the flash head behind you to get it to bounce off the wall and ceiling directly behind you so that the light can effectively become larger and more diffuse. That'll give you potentially softer light because the light's going to be bouncing around the room, coming back towards the subject from several different angles. Most of the better units these days can operate as master units, controlling compatible remote units. And most can operate as remote units in slave mode triggered via radio or optical signal from a master controlling flash or trigger. And we're going to get more into that later. These units also feature different modes, including TTL and high-speed sync, and also most of the time they feature a mode called stroboscopic, which is when the flash emits a series of bursts for one exposure. Now, we're not going to cover that mode for portraiture, but it's something that you might want to experiment with at some point for different types of motion effects. Also, you've got different types of shutter synchronization, rear curtain sync, and regular front curtain sync. These flash units usually have flash zoom so that you can have a wider or tighter beam emitting out of the flash head. And also they come with a wide-angle lens that spreads the light out a bit more for when you're using a wide-angle lens in the camera. You can pull that out along with a bounce card. This little bounce card is for creating catch lights in a subject's eyes with your flash. Now, I don't use the wide angle or bounce card features for most of my flash work. Okay, now let's talk about larger flash units and studio type strobes. These are more powerful than their shoe mount or speedlight counterparts, but they're also larger and heavier. Traditional studio strobes operate on AC power, so you've got to plug them into a wall power outlet. If you're on location or anywhere AC power is not available, some people will bring along a small generator, maybe a gas-powered generator, to provide that portable AC power. Some of these units are powered by high-capacity batteries, which makes them very easy to use on location. Now, these don't mount directly to a camera. They're just way too big. You'll mount these to light stands. In fact, we're going to use light stands for most of our lights, even these smaller speedlight flashes, because we want to position them off camera and we want to use them with larger modifiers, which would be hard to do if you've got your flash mounted to your camera. Most of these units feature built-in swivel mounts so that the unit can be angled up and down. When we mount the smaller speedlights to our light stands, we usually need to add some type of swivel adapter to the mix. Now, you can use these with a variety of lighting modifiers. Modifiers can be mounted to these larger strobes in a number of different ways using built-in mounts or adapters. Many larger strobes now have TTL, high-speed sync, as well as manual controls, and even the stroboscopic features that we were talking about earlier. So a lot of them have the same smart features that are built into the dedicated speedlights. As you might expect, these can be operated and triggered as remote or slave units, but you'll need some type of master control or an optical or radio trigger to get them to sync to the camera. Flash is a really good light source for portraiture, but it's got an extremely short duration compared to natural and other types of constant light. A burst of flash only lasts for hundredths or thousandths of a second, so we have to have some way to make sure that that burst of flash happens during our exposure, right as you click the shutter. We call this flash synchronization or flash sync. There are several ways to synchronize a flash or a group of flashes to our exposure. Some are rudimentary methods, and some are more sophisticated. PC cords and dedicated sync cords are available, but wireless solutions are more flexible. An optical TTL wireless flash sync allows you to trigger multiple flash units with some type of TTL light signals from a light-emitting TTL transmitter, but you can also trigger remote flash units by having them fire when another flash goes off. In this case, no TTL information is transmitted, but you can still these can still be very useful for manual flash. And there is radio flash triggering, which can also transmit manual or TTL signals to your remote flashes. All right, so let's talk about each of these in more detail. We'll start with PC cords. Now, obviously, these are not a wireless solution because a physical cable has to be connected to both the flash and the camera, and you have to have some way to connect that cord. Now, some cameras and flashes don't even have PC cable terminals to connect the cable to. In that case, in order to use a PC cable, you'll need some kind of adapter for the camera, the flash, or both. PC cords come in both standard and locking type. The locking type offers a little more security so that the cord won't just fall out or be pulled out. But the terminals on the flash and camera also need to be the locking type for that even to work. So can you sync more than one flash at a time with a PC cable? Not really. But if you set up your other remote flashes to fire with some type of optical sync, you can. In general, though, I'd say if you can avoid clumsy cables and adapters and limitations of the PC cord, then don't bother with this type of flash triggering. It's also got a reputation for not being very reliable because these PC connectors kind of wear out over time. Dedicated sync cords like this TTL compatible one offer the advantage of real TTL connectivity between your camera and flash. But it's still not wireless, and you've got a very short cord to work with. You can daisy chain multiple cords together, but that can get kind of awkward and expensive. And the flash and the cord and the camera, they all have to be compatible for any of this to work. Can you sync multiple lights with a cord like this? No, but like with a PC cord option, you can set up your other lights to trigger off of the light signals from the connected flash. Potentially, because this type of cord is TTL compatible, you can even transmit master TTL signals to the remote flashes with it, depending on your setup. But I think the best uses for cords like this are for handheld flash, or for use on a flash bracket.
I personally would not recommend these for portrait setups. Okay, now let's get serious. If you want to do flash portraiture in a multi-light setup and you want to do it right, you should go wireless. When we talk about syncing your flash optically, we mean we're sending the trigger signals to fire your remote flash units with some type of light transmission. This can either be done with a flash or with some other light transmitted from your master unit to your remote units. One way to do this is to use your system's optical TTL features to trigger your remote flash units. This is definitely going to give you wireless transmission, which is really great because it frees you from physical cords. The only downside is the limitations of optical transmission. And what I mean by that is that optical transmission requires a line of sight from the controller or master unit to the remote flash. And I have to say that sometimes this type of setup is not reliable in bright outdoor conditions or where you've got too much distance between your master unit and the receiving flash. But in small and medium-sized indoor setups, you shouldn't have much of a problem with optical TTL triggering. Because you're using TTL signals, TTL is supported, but you have to be using compatible gear. So the flash units, camera, and master transmitter, these all have to be compatible with each other for a 100% TTL setup. Your TTL master unit is mounted to your camera's hot shoe, and that master unit can be a dedicated TTL optical trigger, which doesn't have a flash head connected to it, or it can be a TTL compatible flash with a built-in TTL optical trigger. If you have a speedlight that can serve as a master, you can just place that flash in the correct mode to control the remote units in your setup. Also, some cameras have a built-in pop-up flash that can transmit TTL signals to control remote flash units. You can definitely sync multiple lights, often in multiple groups, which allows you to have different settings for different lights in your setup in TTL mode. Now, just because you're using the system's TTL transmission doesn't mean you're limited to just TTL flash. You can switch your flash to manual mode if you like. In this case, you can use TTL to simply sync the flashes while your manual settings determine the actual flash power output of the individual flash units. Of course, if you want to use manual flash, you can trigger your remote flash units optically without any TTL gear. This still gives you the advantage of wireless, but you won't be able to use the automatic flash output control of TTL. Some would argue that manual flash control is going to give you superior and more consistent results over TTL anyway. Okay, obviously, optical sync requires flash detection by each remote unit. And what that means is that the remote units need to see when at least one of the other flash units fires. You can purchase an external electric eye optical slave attachment that connects to a flash, and this is going to pick up when another flash fires, and then it instantaneously sends a sync signal to that flash that it's connected to so that it fires too. But that's kind of an outmoded solution because these days most modern flash units have built-in versions of this type of sync. These are usually identified on flash units as S1 and S2 modes. Now, S1 mode triggers the flash as soon as it detects another flash is fired. S2 mode triggers on the second flash it detects. And the reason it does this is if you're using your camera's built-in flash or an onboard flash that's doing a pre-flash, you don't want your remote flash units firing during that pre-flash phase. You don't want them triggered by that pre-flash. So you want them to fire during the actual flash phase when the actual exposure is happening. So S2 mode on your remote flash ignores the pre-flash from your camera's position and it just fires off during the second real flash. Again, if you're not using TTL, you can just use S1 mode and keep things simple. And yes, you can sync multiple lights this way. All remote units are just set to the proper sync mode, and you can set their individual power outputs manually so that that gives you total and precise control of the lights in your setup. Okay, probably the best solution for flash sync in most situations is radio triggering. Again, this is wireless, and you've got the option of using TTL or non-TTL types of radio triggers. And what's great about radio triggers is that there are no line of sight signal transmission limitations like you've got with optical triggers. And you can use these at much longer distances, either indoors or outdoors. TTL versions of radio triggers and receivers have to be compatible with your camera and flash units, so just make sure that the triggers and flashes work together with your camera for proper TTL use. You can also use these TTL versions to trigger flash units in manual mode, or you can just simply use non-TTL radio triggers for that. Now, the non-TTL versions work universally with almost any camera and flash that allow for manual power settings adjustments. Now, to use these, you'll always have one radio transmitter unit connected to your camera. And it might just be a transmitter unit, or it might be a transmitter that's built into a flash. And depending on the setup, you might need an external matching receiver for each of the remote flash units in your setup. Some flash units have built-in receivers that are compatible with the transmitting unit. And in that case, no external receiver is going to be necessary. And yes, you can definitely sync multiple lights using radio triggers. Whether you're using speedlights or larger strobes, you're going to need some way to set them up in your shot so that you can properly light your subject and your scene. You need a way to support those flash units and any modifiers attached to them. And that's where lighting support gear comes into play. I'm going to give you a quick overview of several pieces of gear. Just keep in mind, this is a small sampling of what's available. I just want to show you some basic gear so that you can get an idea of what you might want to use in your setup. You'll definitely want to use light stands, and if you're using speedlights, you'll need some type of adapter to mount your light to a light stand. And that adapter might also support any modifier you're using. And this might also be the case if you're using a larger strobe. And there's some other lighting support gear that I also want to mention. Light stands are the foundation of lighting support for your flashes. Your stands are going to need to support the weight of the lights and the modifiers that you mount to them. Stands make it possible to adjust the height and position of your lights around the scene. Generally, you'll use one stand for each light, but sometimes you might gang a group of speedlights together onto a single light stand. This effectively just creates a brighter single light source from that stand's position. Light stands come in a variety of maximum heights, load capacities, and ease of portability. Compact stands are usually very lightweight. They collapse and fold up into something very short and easy to carry, but they're not made for heavy loads, and they're usually kind of short. Light and medium capacity stands are very popular. Most of these can handle the majority of the lights and modifiers that you want to mount to them. These are what I use for most of my indoor work. C-stands are probably the most robust. They're very sturdy and can handle a lot of weight, but they're heavier and not very compact. In any event, I think C-stands are the way to go if they aren't too inconvenient for what you're doing. Now, with any stand, I'd recommend the following. Make sure it can carry at least 8 pounds, including the light and modifier. Get a stand that can extend to at least 8 feet. That should be good for most of your portraiture. And try to get air cushion stands. Now, air cushioning slows the collapsing of the stand so there's no jolting drop when you turn a knob on the stand, when that knob is loosened. In other words, when you're adjusting the height of a light or breaking the stand down, you don't want to loosen a knob on the stand just to see your expensive light come crashing down against the next stop on the stand. You can damage a light that way. Adapters for stands and modifiers are often necessary to connect your light to a light stand and or to a modifier. For speedlights, one of the most common types of adapters is the swivel adapter, and sometimes called an umbrella adapter. The bottom hole on the adapter secures to the stud on the end of the light stand, and the flash is mounted to the top. And there's an umbrella shaft hole that secures an umbrella or a softbox rod. Also for speedlights and slightly larger strobes, the S-type adapter is pretty popular. This mounts to the end of a light stand and secures the flash by the head or body of the flash rather than by the flash's foot. It also has a rod holder, but this S-type is a Bowens style mount. So if you want to use a modifier that connects via a Bowens mount, this is going to work. Over on the right, you can see that our larger strobe is connecting directly to a modifier with a Bowens mount. And that's because the front of the light has been fitted with that type of connector. Because this strobe has a built-in swivel mount, it doesn't require a separate mounting adapter between it and the light stand. Other support gear includes things like sandbags and counterbalance weights. You'll use sandbags if you want to give your light stands a little extra weight on the legs to keep them from tipping over, if you're using top-heavy modifiers and accessories. And you can use either sandbags or metal counterbalance weights on things like boom arms. Boom arms extend a light and modifier out, and often these need something on the other end of the bar to balance the weight so everything doesn't just tip over. That weight, because it helps balance the load, can also make it easier to adjust the position of the boom arm. There are also stands that support reflectors and flags. You might also find clips and clamps and grip heads useful for holding things, including background setups. And casters and wheelbases are also available, and these can be placed on some light stands to make them easier to reposition and move around the room. And I might as well just throw in gaffer tape. This is a very handy all-around way to temporarily secure pieces of gear together. I use it for everything, including securing seamless background paper to the floor if I'm extending it out from the background stand. There are so many different and handy accessories out there. You're going to discover a few things that solve common problems that you encounter, and those things will just become part of your lighting setup. By themselves, flash units can pump out a very powerful burst of light, but that light is emitted, at least initially, from a relatively small light source. On a speedlight, for example, the area on the flash that emits that light is only about the size of a business card. Small lights pointed directly at your portrait subject are going to produce a harsh, sometimes unflattering look. We use lighting modifiers to turn those small light sources into larger light sources. Lighting modifiers actually have many different uses. They can help you shape, diffuse, direct, block, and color the light coming out of your flash. We're going to talk a little about umbrellas and softboxes, and I'll just give you an initial overview of other types of modifiers like scrims, snoots, grids, barn doors, flags, and gels. Let's start with umbrellas. And these are extremely useful and very popular types of modifiers used in portraiture. There are generally two types of umbrella modifiers. The first one is the reflector type. With this type, the open or bottom side of the umbrella is directed toward the subject. The flash is pointed into the umbrella, and the light it produces reflects from inside the umbrella back out toward the subject. The reflecting material inside the umbrella can come in white, silver, or gold, and even sometimes blue for effects or color correcting purposes. The other type of umbrella is the shoot-through umbrella, and these are made of translucent material. With these, the top side of the umbrella is directed toward the subject. The flash is placed in the same orientation where it points into the umbrella, but the whole thing is turned around. This way, light shines through the translucent white material to illuminate your subject. Both types of umbrellas are designed to create a larger light source. Umbrellas are easy to set up and collapse, which makes them very compact. They're relatively inexpensive and available in a wide variety of sizes. But you don't want to use umbrellas in windy conditions, especially without help or some dependable way to secure them. Even a slight breeze can catch an umbrella like a sail and tip your entire light stand over, potentially damaging your equipment. Another very popular solution for modifying your lights for portraiture? Softboxes. You might think of a softbox like a shoot-through umbrella, but all the light is directed through the front panel. Light isn't allowed to escape out the back. Also, a softbox usually gives you a flat light source, which results in more even illumination than the curved surface of an umbrella, especially, a shoot-through umbrella. Just like most modifiers, you have a lot of choices. Softboxes are available in a variety of sizes, shapes, and styles. Useful sizes range from 2x2 up to room size or even larger. They can come in square, rectangle, octagonal, that's 8 sides, or rounder shapes like 16-sided versions. You can get shallow, which is a so-called beauty dish style, all the way to deeper, longer softboxes, which are marketed as parabolic styles. Another useful type of softbox is the strip light, which is a long rectangle shape. Most softboxes can be further modified with a grid. These flexible grids are often called egg crate grids, and they help narrow the light as you direct it toward your subject. Unlike umbrellas, which are very easy to open and close, some softboxes can be a little frustrating to set up or break down. Sometimes it's just easier to set one up and leave it that way instead of breaking it down after each shoot. If you shoot on location a lot, then you might not have that choice. Of course, some softboxes are almost as easy to set up and collapse as umbrellas are because of their design. It just depends on what you're using. Just like with umbrellas or any larger modifiers, I suggest you be careful using these outdoors if it's windy. Okay, here's a quick rundown of other types of modifiers. Scrims are anything with a translucent material that helps diffuse light or lower a light's intensity. A scrim can be used with any type of light. I sometimes use one to help tame direct sunlight. Snoots are attached to lights to narrow the beam of light. Grids do the same. They help control the width of the beam. Now, the grids made for softboxes are really large and can cover the entire front panel of the softbox, but smaller grids can be attached more directly to the front of your lights, and these are often made of metal and they narrow the beam by specific amounts. For example, a 20-degree grid creates a narrow beam, whereas a 60-degree grid creates a wider beam. Barn doors is a set of 4 hinged flags that help shape the beam of light coming from a light source. And what's a flag? A flag is a flat panel that helps block light from doing things like spilling onto the background or onto your subject or flaring into the camera. Gels are another important type of modifier, and these are made of colored transparent material. Gels are used to create color effects or do color correction. Now, some gels are not really made to change the color of the light. They're used to reduce the amount of light. Neutral density gels, and you can call them ND gels for short, these are used to reduce the intensity of a light. In this lesson, I'll offer some general gear recommendations that should help you select the flash gear for your needs. Choosing the right flash gear for you comes down to several considerations. You'll want to make sure that you select powerful enough lighting that's going to produce enough light output for your portraits. The cheapest little flash is probably not going to be powerful enough to handle the job. Select a flash that has the features you'll need. Most decent flash units have the necessary feature set, and this would include things like the ability to use the flash in manual mode as well as TTL mode. The style of portraiture you'll be shooting will determine things like the number of lights you'll need and the types of modifiers you'll want to use. Portability is another important factor because although we tend to want the most powerful lights we can get, we don't want something so heavy and bulky as to make location shooting difficult. And this goes for your flash or strobe units as well as the modifiers and the stands and the rest of your support gear. Compatibility with other gear is also very important, especially if you're using trigger transmitters that can control the light's power remotely. The flash units have to be compatible with the trigger or master controller. If you're using TTL, the flash gear has to be compatible with the camera's TTL system. And if you're not relying on TTL or remotely controlling flash power in groups, then basic radio triggers are going to do the job. Of course, budget is a factor for many of us. Lighting comes at many different price points, and yeah, some of the most expensive gear is worth the price. But some of the more budget-friendly lighting will definitely get the job done too. At this stage of the game, though, I can tell you that high-priced gear is probably not going to guarantee better portraits. So don't worry, if you don't have a lot to spend, you can still probably get more than you need right now with a modest budget. Now, I'm assuming you're taking this course because you're just starting out with flash portraiture, and I believe the best way to learn portrait lighting is by becoming proficient with one light at a time. So my initial gear recommendations are going to be based on what you'll need to get started with one light portraiture. Whether it's a single light or you've got multiple lights in your setup, the light we call the key light is the primary, most defining light in your setup. What type of flash will you need for a good basic key light? You can get started with any good flash or strobe, and I'd recommend getting a basic flash like this shoe mount flash, also known as a speedlight. A nice portable strobe like this will also work, but you can only use these off camera, whereas the speedlight can be used off camera, or you can do on camera flash if necessary. Make sure that you use a flash with good power output, something strong enough to work with the modifier, because modifiers reduce the amount of light. How can you make sure that your flash has enough power? Well, flash manufacturers use something called a guide number, or GN number, to help you compare the power between flash units. But the way they use that number isn't always consistent or easy to understand. So I recommend that you just do some research, look at reviews, and pick up a flash that has a good reputation for power output and other features. Get a flash with the option for full manual control of the output. And yes, I'd recommend that you get a flash with TTL capability. It should also give you full manual control over flash power. This one adjusts from full power to 1/128th power in 1/3 increments, and that's pretty common. Like I said before, having the option of TTL is good. So the flash should have TTL compatibility with your camera, and this includes both the flash and the trigger, which is the flash controller. Matching this flash with your camera's TTL compatibilities works like this. Now, this particular flash comes in several manufacturer-specific models, and I can use this Sony version directly on the hot shoe of my Sony camera. More importantly, the flash controller has to be compatible with the camera. This controller will translate the Sony TTL signals to the matching remote flash. So in this case, any flash compatible with this trigger will work properly as long as the trigger is compatible with the camera. Now, don't get too hung up on the technicalities of this right now. Just make sure you get a flash trigger and flash that are compatible with each other and your camera. Alternatively, if you know that you'll never want to use TTL features for automatic flash output control, you can use simple manual-only flashes or strobes. They work just as well, and you'll only need a basic non-TTL flash trigger. None of this gear is going to have to be specifically compatible with your camera system. Again, the only thing you'll be missing is the TTL feature set. If you're going to use something like simple studio strobes like Alien Bees, a basic non-TTL trigger is fine. Make sure you select a convenient size for your needs. Like I said previously, you can get a larger strobe, and I definitely recommend that if you can use it. This strobe has a lot more power than a standard flash, but these are heavier, bulkier, and more expensive. But both of these have the same basic functionality. Either type will work fine for indoor portraiture and many types of outdoor portraiture. I recommend purchasing flash units which are compatible with your camera's TTL system. Now, TTL is actually something I rarely use in my portraiture. It's more of a convenience tool if I'm very short on time, and it's primarily something that I'd use with on-camera flash photography. Since many of the flash options out there are priced similarly, whether a flash is totally manual or has both manual and TTL capability, I figure why not just get the option? So let's talk about what TTL actually is. Now, TTL's job is to make things easier and more automatic. TTL works like an instantaneous flash metering that's done by the camera just prior to the real flash and exposure. When you click the shutter, TTL does a pre-flash, and your camera meters the way the light fell on the scene. It then calculates what the actual flash power should be for a good exposure and sends a signal back to the flash to fire at that power. The shutter opens, the flash fires at the calculated power setting, and the shutter closes. All of this happens so fast you might not even notice a pre-flash. And what all this means is that you as the photographer don't have to worry about setting the flash power manually. The flash, the camera, and TTL system handle all that for you. TTL is also very helpful in fluid, fast-paced situations where you don't have time to take a lot of test shots, or where you're taking photos on the move. If you're doing portraits using on-camera flash, TTL is invaluable because your distance between the subject and your light, your flash, changes as your camera to your subject distance changes. TTL even works when you bounce on-camera flash. And in situations where you have someone following your subject with a handheld off-camera light, as the subject to the light distances change, your light output also needs to be adjusted, usually very quickly, and TTL is going to take care of that for you. The major downside to TTL is that it's not foolproof. Sometimes TTL can evaluate the scene in ways that don't actually result in good flash exposures, and TTL can potentially give you inconsistent results. If anything changes the way the camera evaluates the lighting in the scene, it's going to change the output of the flash. So in that case, your shots aren't going to look the same from one photo to the next. So TTL is an automatic feature, but there are ways to make adjustments to correct or tweak the output from TTL. And we do this with flash exposure compensation, which is something we're going to get into later. All right, let's discuss how to activate and use TTL with a Sony camera and a Godox flash as our example. Now, your camera and flash can probably be set up in much the same way. First thing we do is make sure the flash is set to TTL mode. Your camera and flash might use the label TTL or iTTL. Next, set the flash to slave mode, and we want to do this using radio transmission if possible. Check that your channel and group settings are correct. I'm using channel 1 and my key light will be in group A. I also make sure my trigger or flash controller is on the same channel and group for the flash and that it's set to the correct flash mode. TTL is a great tool when you're using flash for portraits under certain conditions. For example, if you're working in fast-paced conditions like event photography, where you have to snap quick photos in lots of different locations and lighting situations with limited time, TTL will allow you to speed up the process. But with TTL, you're trading convenience for control and consistency. Taking manual control of your camera and flash settings is a great way to improve your portraiture. Manual gives you more control and more consistent results. So when should you use manual flash instead of TTL? Well, manual flash is great for static portrait setups. In other words, if your lights and your subject are going to remain stationary in relation to each other, manual is a good way to go. Let's talk about how to set up manual remote flash triggering using an external flash trigger. First, you take your flash and you make sure its mode is set to manual. It should also be in one of the slave modes so that it can be triggered when you click your shutter button. Now, I prefer using a radio trigger that matches my flash, so I use radio slave mode. Make sure the channel and group settings are set. Here I'm using channel 1 and group A. And you can adjust the power to whatever you need. Of course, I can also adjust the power from the radio trigger that I use. But I have to make sure the radio trigger is set up to control the same channel and group the flash is on. Of course, the mode for that group should also be manual. If I were using a basic dumb trigger, in other words, something that doesn't allow you to adjust anything remotely, it just tells the flash when to fire, I'd have to make any adjustments directly on the flash or the strobe itself, and that's okay. I don't mind doing that because when my test shots are done and I've locked down my remote flash settings, I won't have to change them again. Of course, if I make any major changes in terms of the subject's distance to the lighting, or if I want to switch out a modifier, or even if I want to change some of my camera settings, I might have to change the power settings on my flash. It's one thing to know how to activate and use your flash units in TTL mode or in manual mode. It's another thing to understand how the settings on your flash, together with the settings on your camera, affect exposure and the look of your images. This topic is so involved and potentially so challenging for beginners to grasp, I think a lot of people just give up trying to figure it out. But two things. One, you will be able to understand how flash and exposure work together. And two, it's necessary to understand this topic if you want to become proficient at flash exposure. Sure, you can avoid learning these important concepts and use TTL most of the time, but there are going to be times when you're faced with a situation where TTL isn't available or reliable or just isn't appropriate for the thing that you're trying to do. In those cases, you'll really wish you understood how to take full control of your flash and camera to create good pictures. In this section, we're going to talk about how exposure works and how flash exposure works. As a way of making sure that you don't become discouraged, I don't want you to give up. Let me just say, these concepts aren't something that you learn in one sitting. It might take some time to wrap your head around some of these things. But take it slow, one step at a time, and stick with it. You'll be rewarded with the ability to do just about anything you can imagine with flash portraits. You don't have to learn it all at once to start making good portraits right away. Just get the basics down and keep learning as you go. I want to give you a quick overview of how exposure works and how you can control and manipulate exposure using your camera settings. Now, there are three basic camera settings affecting exposure, and these are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now, all three need to be in balance in order to maintain the exposure you want. Adjusting one setting requires an adjustment to one or both of the other two settings to maintain the same exposure. Now, in photography, we measure light and its effect in the camera in a way that's become pretty standard. Adjustments to our settings correlate to increments called stops. So if you change a setting and you adjust it by one stop, this either doubles or halves the amount of light or its effect on the sensor. If you make an adjustment that lowers a setting by one stop, this is going to require an increase in one or both of the other settings to make up for it. Now, for people who don't want to learn how exposure works or they'd like a little help from the camera, there's good news. Your camera can automatically manage these exposure settings for you. These automatic modes are available on most cameras. You've got full automatic, which is much like point and shoot. The camera determines all the settings for you. You have program, which is also creative or scenes modes. The camera makes most decisions for you in this mode, but you can adjust exposure or shutter speed up or down, and the camera will balance the other settings to maintain the same exposure. Aperture priority, this is where you determine the f-stop and you let the camera determine shutter speed. Shutter priority is where you determine shutter speed and let the camera determine the f-stop. And there's also manual exposure mode, which puts you in total control of exposure settings. In this case, the camera doesn't help you by automatically adjusting settings for you. And I just thought I would throw this in because although this isn't an automatic exposure mode, it's something that you're going to be using. Let's talk about exposure compensation. This is a way to override your camera's automatic exposure settings decisions. So the exposure compensation adjustment can be handy with something like P mode or aperture priority or shutter priority modes. Exposure compensation helps tweak the exposure of ambient or any constant light in your scene. So taking flash out of the equation, if you take a photo and notice the scene or your subject is coming out a little too dark, you dial up the exposure compensation to lighten things up. If the scene or subject look too bright, dial down the exposure compensation to darken things. Now your camera's automatic metering is still in effect, but exposure compensation allows you to bump things up or down if you need to. Make sure to check your camera's manual if you don't know how to access your exposure compensation control. Note that the exposure compensation control is generally not related to the flash portion of the exposure. Here, we're just talking about ambient light or constant light exposure in the scene. All right, we've talked about regular exposure. So now let's get into flash exposure, which is the result of camera exposure settings combined with flash illumination. Of course, flash is just another source of light for your scene. All three basic camera settings, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, affect the exposure of ambient constant light in a scene. The camera's basic exposure settings are always in play. Think of it this way. Even if you're using flash, the camera's basic exposure settings affect how any light in your scene is recorded. However, only two of those settings, aperture and ISO, affect the exposure of flash illuminated parts of the scene. In a second, we'll talk about why that's the case. All right, remember how I said in photography, light is measured in stops? Well, your flash power setting can add or subtract light to parts of the scene, and we quantify the amount of flash-produced light in stops, just like we do with constant light. So, when we talk about flash exposure, we can say flash exposure is often controlled with flash power, or the amount of light the flash is adding to the scene. Flash power output can be controlled either manually, where you set a specific power setting, or via TTL, where an unknown power setting is determined automatically. Let's talk about how flash actually works and how it's different from the ambient or constant light in a scene. Well, one, flash is usually a more powerful and intense light than other light in your scene. And two, the light the flash produces is a very quick burst of light, so quick that it usually only lasts for a fraction of the time that the camera shutter is open during exposure. The flash only illuminates the subject for a tiny moment, even as your camera continues to record the picture. The shutter opens, the camera begins taking the photo, and shortly after that, the flash fires for a few milliseconds and then stops. But the camera is still taking the photo until the shutter finally closes. Think about this. When you click the shutter, the camera starts recording the scene and any constant light in the scene. If, during that exposure, a flash goes off and lights up part of the scene, the camera will record that light too. So it's kind of like there are two different exposures happening at the same time when the shutter's open. There's the constant light exposure and there's the flash exposure. And during exposure, in other words, during the time the shutter's open, the camera is really just recording any light bright enough to record. Remember how in automatic exposure modes, you can override the camera's exposure settings with the exposure compensation feature? If you're using TTL for flash, which is an automatic flash output control, you might find that the flash and camera aren't calculating the right amount of flash for the scene, at least to your liking. Fortunately, just like with regular exposure compensation for ambient light, there is a way to override flash settings determined by TTL. You can do this with something called flash exposure compensation. Flash exposure compensation is a setting that helps you tweak the flash output in TTL. You can dial the power up or down when using the flash in TTL mode. If you're using your flash in manual mode, you don't have to deal with flash exposure compensation because you're controlling the flash precisely with specific power adjustments. There's no need to make relative adjustments. So flash exposure compensation is not used in manual flash mode. Controlling flash output with TTL is pretty easy. If your subject looks too dark, dial up the flash power with flash exposure compensation. If your subject looks too bright, dial down the flash power with flash exposure compensation. Controlling flash output with manual settings isn't that much harder, but it requires either using a flash meter or simply just taking test shots because you don't have TTL helping you. Remember that flash exposure compensation is not related to and doesn't really affect the look of ambient and constant light in the exposure. Here are some things to keep in mind when thinking about settings for flash exposure. Think of your flash exposure on your subject as separate from ambient light exposure. Sometimes this means you'll adjust your settings to get the background light just the way you want it. Then you'll dial in flash power on your subject to your liking. For settings, ISO should be as low as is practical to minimize noise. Shutter speed should be set to the highest normal sync speed, and on your camera that might be something like 1/250th of a second. Use a slower shutter speed if you want to record more ambient light. A slower shutter speed won't really affect the flash exposure. Aperture is a creative choice, but I generally suggest not going past f11, like I often shoot between f4 and f8. As for flash power, you want to dial in enough light to illuminate the subject for the desired exposure. If you're using manual flash, manual is going to give you full control over this. If you're using TTL, TTL is going to determine your power setting. And in that case, you can use flash exposure compensation to adjust the flash output if you need to. As an example of settings to use, here are some that I often start with. My ISO is usually set to 100. Shutter speed is at flash sync speed of 1/250th of a second, and aperture is f4. And I use manual flash with an umbrella or softbox and usually start at 1/8 power on that flash if I'm using a regular speed light. You should know by now that there's more than one combination of camera and flash settings that'll give you a good exposure in a given situation. For example, in a manual setup, you might find that with your flash at 1/2 power and about 3 feet from your subject, your camera's exposure settings are good at ISO 100, at f8, and a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second. Now that means if you decrease your flash output by half to 1/4 power and increase your ISO by double to ISO 200, you're going to get the same result. Or if after decreasing flash output to 1/4 power, instead of adjusting your ISO, you could adjust your f-stop by opening it up to f5.6, which allows double the amount of light to enter your camera than f8. So with any of these combinations, you'll get the same type of exposure. That being the case, which is the best combination to use? Well, that comes down to creative and practical decisions. When you're sticking to standard types of exposure, two types of settings can dramatically affect the look of an image. That's aperture and shutter speed. Aperture affects two things. One is the amount of light allowed through to the sensor during exposure, and the other is depth of field. The first affects exposure, and the second is a creative tool. If you want to decrease depth of field, you'll open up the aperture. In other words, use lower f-stop numbers. If you want to increase depth of field, you'll stop down the aperture, which is the same as using higher f-stop numbers. In other words, if you want to get a shallow depth of field effect, let's say that you want a tight focus on your subject's eyes, but you want focus to drop off farther back toward the ears and hair, you'd use a wide aperture setting of something like f2.8 or wider. That choice of f-stop is going to affect your decisions on ISO and flash power. When you use a wider aperture, you'll usually need to use lower ISOs and lower flash power settings. If, however, you want a sharp focus covering your entire subject, maybe even the background, you'd use a smaller aperture of, say, f11 or even f16. But that smaller aperture cuts down on the amount of light coming into the camera during the exposure. So you'll need to add more power to your flash, and you'll possibly need to boost your ISO. To reiterate, with manual flash and camera settings, if you make an adjustment to your aperture, in other words, change your f-stop, you'll have to change one or more of the following to put the exposure back into balance. You'll either have to adjust your flash power or your ISO or both. All right, as we've discussed, shutter speed isn't something that will affect your flash exposure in native flash sync speeds or slower, but shutter speed will affect the way any constant or ambient light is recorded. So shutter speed affects two things. One, the amount of time that ambient or constant light is allowed through to the sensor, because shutter speed determines the actual duration of exposure. And two, the potential to record more ambient or constant light and any movement, motion, or camera shake. With a flash portrait, if you want to add more ambient light to the picture, you can use a slower shutter speed. This isn't going to affect the flash exposure. However, additional ambient light might be recorded on your subject. Let's say you're shooting a portrait in a room with warm lighting present in the background. At your camera's regular flash sync speed, you might notice a lamp in the background just doesn't appear to be on, or it just doesn't look bright enough. Now, if you slow your shutter speed down to, say, something like 1/40th of a second, for example, you might notice the light from the lamp is now showing up. So making adjustments to shutter speed is a good way to control how much of the ambient light shows up in your flash portraits. Remember, the flash portion of your exposure doesn't change, but more ambient light will affect your exposure as you lower your shutter speed. With manual camera settings, you can also increase the amount of ambient light recorded using aperture and ISO settings, but just remember that these will also affect your flash exposure. When setting up our portrait lighting, one of the first things we need to address is the key light. The key light's the most predominant defining light in your setup. And in the case of one light portraiture, you'll only have the key light to deal with. Generally speaking, any other light you add to your portrait setup is going to play a supporting role. This includes fill lighting to reduce contrast, rim or hair light to add separation or interesting highlights, and background lighting. Your key light can be any type of light source. It can be constant light, like natural light or some type of lamp, or it can be flash or strobe lighting. In this section, we're going to discuss how to set up and use a flash as our key light. There are lots of ways to do this and many different types of gear that you can do this with, but it all comes down to one thing. We're simply positioning a light on a stand. The light might be a speed light, it might be a larger strobe, it might be bare, or you might decide to put some type of modifier over it, but it's still just a light placed on a stand that allows you to adjust its position. Let's start with the lighting stand. There are several types to choose from, ranging from heavy-duty C stands down to very compact light-duty stands. C stands can handle a lot of weight and abuse, and they're great for studio work. Small compact stands are good for run-and-gun portraits when you need to keep your gear small and you're not working with heavy lights and modifiers. The middle-of-the-road stands are what I usually use. These are generally a good compromise between the heavy-duty and super compact types. Good ones can handle a strobe and small or medium-sized modifier, and they're light and easy to carry. When you're looking for a light stand, make sure to check the specs because you'll want to know that it can exceed the normal height and weight requirements that you have. My recommendations: it should have a load capacity of at least 8 pounds, a maximum height of at least 8 feet, and it should be air cushioned, which slows the collapsing of the stand to help prevent damage to your light if, an adjusting knob is loosened at the wrong time. The top of your light stand should have a stud for securing the load, which will usually consist of some type of swivel, a light, and a modifier. If you're using something larger than a speedlight, it'll probably have a swivel already built into the unit, so you can just slip it onto the light stand like this, and tighten to secure it to the stud. This unit features a Bowens type mount, which allows me to attach this softbox, which has a Bowens type speed ring. This is a very popular type of mount, but there are others. I can also attach a standard shoot-through umbrella, or any type of modifier that I choose. If you're using a smaller, compact strobe or a speedlight, you'll probably need a separate adapter to not only mount it to the light stand, but to give it the ability to take on a lighting modifier. This adapter should also provide swivel functionality. Two types of popular adapters are the standard umbrella swivel bracket and the S-type bracket. The umbrella swivel bracket looks like this. The top part will have a hole for the umbrella shaft, and you'll secure the bottom part to the light stand like this. The hole for the umbrella shaft is angled for better alignment between the flash and umbrella, and you'll know if the umbrella shaft is inserted into the adapter in the correct way when the swivel's main adjustment knob or lever is on the right-hand side if you're facing the umbrella. And by the way, make sure to use a well-built metal umbrella adapter that won't slip under heavier loads. Some of the cheaper quality ones wear out pretty quick. Your flash is mounted to the top of the bracket with a cold shoe. Some brackets have these built in, but if you need to attach one yourself, you can use a cold shoe like this. Attach a stud to it. This is a 3/8 inch thread, which is pretty common. And secure the stud into the bracket like this. Secure the speedlight to the cold shoe so that the light is directed toward the umbrella, and you'll adjust the swivel with the adjustment knob or lever. There are also softbox modifiers that can attach to this bracket. These usually have an umbrella shaft that can be inserted into the bracket. Now, if you use one that encloses the flash and bracket inside the softbox, it can be a little less convenient than the type that keeps the flash and bracket on the outside. That's where the other type of bracket, the S-type, might be more useful. The S-type bracket allows you to secure a small flash to your light stand even if the flash doesn't have a standard foot. This bracket also allows you to use modifiers like umbrellas and other types that use Bowens-style connectors. This bracket attaches to the top of your light stand just like the other swivel adapter. Place the flash here and tighten just enough to keep it secure. If you're using an umbrella, just slide the shaft through this hole and tighten the knob to secure it. If you're attaching a modifier like this softbox, just match up and secure the connection. You can see here that the flash and swivel controls stay on the outside of the modifier, keeping them visible and accessible. Your specific setup to this point is dependent on your gear and how you're triggering your flash. For example, if you're using an external radio trigger receiver with your remote flash, you'll have to find a way to secure it to your setup. You might stack it like this. If you're using one that requires a separate adapter, you might set things up more like this. And if you're not using radio triggering, but you're using optical, you'll have to make sure that your setup allows your flash and trigger to communicate with each other, and that usually requires a line of sight, which probably won't work if your flash is hidden inside a modifier. That brings us to modifiers. Now, there are countless styles and designs of lighting modifiers for portraiture, and it can be fun to experiment with different kinds as you gain more experience. If you want to know what the best type of modifier is for portraiture, I have to say it's just like with most things in photography, there's no one right answer. It really comes down to what works for you. At this stage, I think the important thing is for you to understand how to select the types of modifiers you'll want to use based on the looks that you're trying to achieve. And we're talking generally about the quality of light that you want for your subject's main lighting. Do you want hard, contrasty light or soft light? Hard light's easy to create because you can do it without a modifier. Just use bare flash. This gives you abrupt light to shadow transitions and really brings out the texture in surfaces. So-called soft light is typically more flattering for most subjects because the light to shadow transitions are wider, which softens the look of texture and features. You create softer looking light across your subject by spreading the light around so it covers more area. Every light creates shadows, but with larger light sources near your subject, parts of the light also help fill in some of the shadows the light creates. Modifiers like umbrellas or softboxes help turn the relatively small emission of your flash into what becomes an effectively larger light source. These modifiers diffuse and widen the light. And this is usually a good starting point for portraiture, a somewhat larger and softer light whose position we can control. It's as simple as that. So what modifier to use? Well, either a softbox or a shoot-through umbrella. That's where I'd suggest that you start. Get one that is at least 24 inches wide, but 43 inches to 48 inches is even better. Umbrellas are usually easier to transport, set up, and break down, but softboxes tend to produce more controlled output. But either one is going to make excellent portraits possible with the correct use of technique. On a side note, there are ways to achieve big, broad, soft light without an attached modifier. You can bounce your flash lighting off a light-colored wall so that the wall, in effect, becomes a large reflected light. In the right position, this will give your subject a beautiful, soft key light. But using a dedicated key light with a modifier is going to give you a lot more control. Once your light's set up, you'll want to test your remote flash triggering to verify the connection. With respect to our key light, there are 5 traditional ways to light a face for portraiture. And these are short lighting. This is good for most subjects. It's a classic and flattering lighting pattern. Rembrandt lighting is very classic and somewhat dramatic as a style of lighting. Broad lighting, when you want to make a narrow face look a little fuller. Butterfly lighting, this is a glamorous old Hollywood style of lighting. And split lighting, where half of the face is in light and the other half is in shadow. Now, we're almost always using some variation on one or more of these lighting patterns when we set up our key light, whether we're aware of it or not. In fact, you don't have to consciously attempt a specific technique to create a well-lighted portrait. You'll learn the general placement of your light that suits most portraiture and make any adjustments according to what looks right to you at the time. Again, remember that these are the patterns we refer to when discussing our key light. But the effects produced by additional lighting, ambient lighting, and reflectors, those do play a role in the overall look of your portrait. In practice, achieving a specific lighting pattern isn't really top of mind, but it's still a good idea to learn about these lighting patterns because whether you know you're using them or not, they provide the basis for most portraiture lighting. And if you need to communicate what you're trying to achieve to an assistant or another photographer, you'll know the correct shorthand to get the message across. So in this section, I'll explain each of these 5 patterns in detail. We'll list them out and tell you how each one is defined, what it's for, and how to achieve it with the key light. All right, let's start by placing our key light in the standard 45-45 position. That's about 45 degrees to one side of the camera to subject axis and pointed down about 45 degrees toward the subject's face. And that's really just a way to think about it. 45 degrees isn't a rule that you have to follow. I'm going to use a constant light instead of a strobe to demonstrate the portrait lighting patterns we've been talking about. And the constant light makes it easier to visualize how the lighting position affects the look. All right, let's demonstrate the short lighting first. The short light pattern is one of my favorites and probably the best for most portraiture. Short light can help you narrow the face, and it's a flattering look for most people. Turn the head a little, now we get the Rembrandt lighting pattern. This is a very classic look. Notice the triangle of light here, which is one of the characteristics of this pattern. A variation on this is the loop lighting pattern, where the shadow just beneath the triangle is broken. With the room lights on, you can see the lighting placement a little more clearly. All right, let's turn the head so we get what's called the broad lighting pattern. As you can see, this can make a face look a little wider. So if you've got a subject with a narrow face, you might want to give broad lighting a try. You can add in varying degrees of fill light with any of these patterns, and that's something that we're going to discuss later. Fill light, whether it's reflective or produced with another strobe, can help you reduce contrast by filling in the shadows. And the closer the reflector or stronger the fill light, the more you'll reduce the effect of the shadows on the shadow side. But again, we'll get more into that as we progress. Now we'll move the light just in front and above the subject's head to get the butterfly lighting pattern. And I'll vary the light position so you can see how this affects the look. This is sometimes described as an old Hollywood look, and it has the characteristics of the butterfly-shaped shadow under the nose, depending on how you tweak it. This light is great for hiding certain flaws as well as accentuating things like cheekbones and the chin. The neck gets this large shadow cast on it, making the front of the face the main focus. Then there's a split lighting pattern, which is also fairly dramatic. It has its uses, but it isn't the best for standard portraiture. Now, these are all examples using a direct hard light source, but most of the time, you'll be using some kind of umbrella or softbox for your main light in order to cut down on the hard contrast. Here's a quick run through of the patterns using a softbox this time. And notice the transitions between light and shadow are wider, giving you that softer look. The reason this is happening is because the softbox helps create a larger light source, spreading the light around the subject in varying intensities. Standardization is a good way to keep the guesswork out of your portrait sessions. It'll help save time and reduce stress and generally improve the quality of your exposures and lighting. You're going to want to establish your initial light position, power settings, and camera settings. Over time, you'll find that you'll default to the same initial placement and settings for a particular flash and modifier. It's a good idea to have a go-to starting point like this because it'll speed up the setup process and reduce the number of test shots before you commence with the actual portrait sitting. Here's an example. Let's say for my key light, I normally use this 36-inch octagonal softbox modifier, including the internal baffle. And I like to place it about 2.5 feet away from my subject in this position. My flash is this AD400. My native flash sync with this camera is 1/250th of a second. And I like to stick to using ISO 100 if I can get away with it. Most of the time, I start with an aperture of f4. If I'm using TTL for flash control, I can let the camera figure out the flash power setting for me. And of course, if the result needs to be tweaked, I can use flash exposure compensation to adjust. If I'm manually controlling the flash output, I'll set the flash power to the same starting point I always use for this setup. And this should put me very close to the results I expect, and I'll make adjustments as necessary. So the next time I'm setting up for a portrait, I'll know this. My camera settings are ISO 100, shutter speed 1/250th of a second, and my aperture is f4, and the flash power is going to be set to 1/16th. With this particular flash and modifier, these are my initial working settings, and I start by placing the key light in the same general position each time. This should give me pretty good results right from the start, and I think you'll agree that's better than starting from scratch each time. Background lighting and exposure is something we'll be concerned with, especially in multiple lighting setups, but it's still important to consider the background and environment in any type of portraiture, including those times when we're using only one flash as our key light. Now, the background can help give the subject of our portrait some context and help tell a story. At the other end of the spectrum, a background can be completely devoid of detail. Another option is to use minimal background information that helps make the image more interesting. Even just using some color or texture can help create a reference point so that your subject won't just appear to be floating in an empty space. The main considerations when including backgrounds in your portraits are distractions. Make sure your background provides just enough but not too much visual detail and information needed to tell the story or highlight the subject. Don't let the background become a distraction. Illumination. The way the background appears in your image is going to depend largely on the lighting it's receiving in the shot. If the lighting is too low, the background might fade off into darkness. If there are bright spots, they might pull the viewer's eye away from the subject. The creative use of background often goes hand in hand with a thoughtful approach to background lighting. In a one-light setup, you can control the way your background is illuminated by managing the distance between your light and the background. Adjusting your shutter speed is also a good way to allow more background and ambient light to show up in your flash portraits. Of course, this is where we get into balanced lighting. Think of lighting the background as a separate issue from lighting the subject, so light them separately, but remember to keep things in balance. Again, this is something you'll think about more when working with multiple lights, but in most environments, you'll be dealing with some other type of lighting, whether it's natural or indoor ambient light. And actually, when we use the term balanced lighting, we're not just referring to light intensity for different parts of the image, but we're often using this term to talk about the different lighting temperatures that might create unwanted color casts in our picture. Finally, for backgrounds, consider focus. Imagine a busy background setting, like a busy workshop environment where the subject is in sharp focus, but so is everything else in the shot. This is another way that the background can become a distracting element. If you adjust your camera settings, and we're specifically talking about f-stop, You can ensure that your subject remains in focus while the background has just the right amount of blur, areas being out of focus. Remember that larger apertures like f2.8 will throw more of the background out of focus, and smaller apertures like f11 or f16 will bring more of the background into focus. This ability to control depth of field is a great creative tool. You've learned that the key light is the most important light in your portrait lighting setup. And this is true in the sense that the key light's role is to create the defining light pattern on your subject's face. All other lights play a supporting role. But that doesn't mean that those other lights aren't important. In this section, we're going to move beyond the one light portrait and explore multi-light setups. We'll look at how fill lighting, hair and rim lighting, background lighting, and double side lighting can affect a portrait. You'll see that as we add more light sources, we can create more sophisticated looks. But we're also introducing more complexity because now we have more than one light to manage, which usually means a few more test shots will have to be taken before a lighting setup is finalized. But the extra time is usually well worth the extra effort. After the key light is set, a fill light is pretty often the next step. The reason for this is because the key light tends to create a simple pattern consisting of strong light on one side of the subject's face and strong shadow on the other. Smaller key lights produce harder contrast, and larger key lights produce softer transitions from light to shadow. Either way, you might want to reduce the effect of the shadows. And you can do this by adding in some illumination on the shadow side of the face opposite the key light. Filling in the shadows is the job of the fill light. Sometimes fill light can be created without any additional lighting gear. If your portrait setup is happening in a small or medium-sized room, some of the light from your key light might bounce around, reflecting off light-colored walls and other surfaces. This light might reflect back onto the subject from different directions, creating, in effect, a fill light situation. Other times, you can use other light sources, including ambient light, to help fill in the shadows created by the key. But if you want total control over your fill light, you can use a dedicated light or reflector. Let's start with a reflector as a solution. A reflector is usually some type of white board or material that can be easily positioned within the lighting setup, usually within a few inches of your subject's face. The reflector's job in this scenario is to bounce some of the light from the key back onto the subject from a different angle. This helps fill in the shadows. Now, I often use a piece of white foam core mounted to a light stand with an A-clamp, or sometimes I use a proper photoreflector. Now, on kind of a side note, lots of times photographers talk about the difference between the amount of light striking the subject from different light sources, and they talk about lighting ratios. When a fill light of any type is being used, the photographer might say they're looking for a 2-to-1 ratio, which means they want the subject's face to get half as much light on one side as the other. Now, ratios are good for communicating specific looks, and these can be measured pretty accurately with light and flash meters. This can also help if you want to reproduce a look in another portrait sitting, or if you find yourself using different gear sometimes. But with a little experience, you can create good lighting ratios without thinking about them too much. For example, if you place your fill reflector about 8 inches from your subject's face opposite the key light, you might like the way that looks. But if you find that it's actually adding too much light to the shadow side and you'd like a little more contrast, you can move the reflector back out to 16 inches and see if that works better for you. If you'd like more control over the fill lighting, you can use an actual second light in your setup. So this will give you a key light and a fill light, a 2-light setup. The advantage of this is that you can use any adjustable flash. It doesn't have to be identical to your key light, and you can use your choice of modifier to help create the look you're going for. Here's an example of a strobe as a key light and a speed light as a fill. In multi-light setups, I like to build up starting with the key light, then going one light at a time. All right, so we start with our key light. In this case, the Godox AD400 Pro with a Glow Easy Lock 36-inch Octa softbox modifier. My camera settings are ISO 100 at f6.3 and 1/250th of a second. I'm using a simple Godox X1T to control the flash units. Now I'll place the AD400 Pro in flash group A, And I've got the front panel of the softbox positioned about 2 feet from the subject's face. I usually begin with my light set to about 1/8 power, and I'll do a few test shots to zero in on a good power setting. In this case, I decided to go with 1/16 power. Now this is all for demonstration, of course, because in reality, I'd probably be shooting at f4 and my power settings on my lights might be refined to thirds of a stop in some cases. I just want to keep these light power settings simple for this lesson. All right, next, let's set up our fill light. We're going to use a Godox TT685, and I'll set this light to a different group, Group B, so I can control the 2 lights independently of each other. And remember, I've got my key light in Group A. I'm using a Godox 32-inch octagon softbox on the shadow side. Now I want to show you a series of settings so that you can see how they change the look of the portrait. So here's 1/64th power, 1/32nd, 1/16th, and 1/8th power. Then we really start going too far with the light by the time we get closer to full power. So as you can see here, I decided to go with this particular fill light setup and distance at 1/32nd power, and my key remains where I liked it at 1/16th. Now keep in mind, there are plenty of variables that come into play when talking about specific power settings, even if you're using essentially the same type of gear. A fill light might not only add illumination to the shadow side, but it'll probably add some light to the areas the key light is taking care of. Also, things like slight distance variations between the lights and the subject, modifier type and size, whether or not you're using baffles in the softboxes, skin tones, and many other things that affect your final flash power settings. And of course, changes to your ISO or f-stop are definitely going to affect things. So again, these power settings are just for demonstration, and they may not work for you in a similar lighting setup. Take test shots and build up the lighting one light at a time. And if you're working with basic radio triggers, the type that don't control discrete flash groups, then you can just adjust the power at the light source. So you'll go to each individual flash unit and adjust the power there. Again, start with the key light, and when that's exactly where you want it and the power setting works for you, move on to the fill light. Now, use whatever modifiers that you want to use to achieve the looks that you're going for. Here I'm using generic 43-inch shoot-through umbrellas, and here are my results. Now, the image on the left is the key light only at 1/8 power, and on the right I've added the fill light at 1/16th power. And these lights were each maybe about 2.5 feet from the subject. The point of lighting for portraiture is to model and capture a person's likeness. And usually we want to do this in a way that's both flattering and in line with what the person really looks like. They need to be recognizable to some extent. We can accomplish this in any environment using good lighting techniques and by being cognizant of the light, shadows, and the way the subject appears against the background. Of course, there are other things that will affect the look of the person in the portrait. Things like pose, expression, camera angles, lens choices, things like that. But our focus in this course is on the lighting. And now we're going to talk about one of the most prevailing light scenarios in both video and still photography: 3-point lighting. 3-point lighting not only looks professional and sophisticated, it also has very practical applications. Keep in mind, each light in a 3-point lighting setup has a purpose. You already know that the key light is the foundation. It's the light that really defines the subject, or at least how you want the subject's features to appear in the picture. And you know that a fill light's purpose is to fill in the shadows to some degree and lower the contrast of the lighting pattern. The fill light could be an actual light source, or it could be some type of reflector. Either way, it counts as a second light for this discussion. The third light in a 3-point scenario is usually a backlight or a hair light of some sort. And the purpose of this light is to create a highlight or outline around an area of the subject to help visually separate the subject from the background. Even if you can already make out the difference between the subject and background, this highlight tends to pop the subject out visually, making the scene a little more three-dimensional. So here's our third light being used as a hair light. All right, so now let's talk about how all of this comes together. First, I'll set up my key, And this is the Godox AD400 Pro with a glow 36-inch octagonal softbox about 2 feet from the subject in the typical placement. We're at ISO 100 f8 at 1/250th of a second. That's going to be the settings for all of the following shots, and I'll let you know if we make any changes to the camera settings. Now here's a result with just the key light. Next we add in the fill light. In this case, the fill light is a Godox TT685 flash modified with a 24-inch Lastolite softbox. It's placed about 3 feet from the subject, and you can see how at 1/8 power, this light is providing just enough illumination to lightly fill in the shadows on the left side of the face. Finally, we'll place another TT685 on a light stand and small boom arm so it's positioned just above the subject's head at about 18 inches, and we've set the power of this unmodified flash to 1/32nd power. You can usually adjust the angle of the beam coming out of these flash units, and this one is set to a 20mm zoom setting just so it's not too concentrated on one spot. And I'll assign my hair light to a separate flash group so I can control it independently using the master control unit from the camera position. Now I'm using the Godox X1T for that. So I've got the key light in group A, the fill light in group B, and the hair light in group C. And I'm able to adjust any of these with the X1T, again, independently. And here's the results with all 3 lights in use. Of course, you can use 3 lights any way you want, and that third light can be placed on the background instead of the subject if you like. And to demonstrate that, I'll just turn the hair light flash away from the subject and toward the background. Now it's about 3 feet from the background, and I've bumped the power of that light to 1/8 power, still at the 20mm, relatively wide zoom setting. And here's what that looks like. Of course, the more lights you have, the more you can do. A 4th light would allow me to point one at the background and still have my hair light along with the key light and fill light. If you've learned how to use a key light, a fill, and a hair light or backlight together, you've pretty much learned most of what you need to know to do high-quality portraiture. But there are plenty of other techniques that might come in useful as you continue learning and expanding your expertise. In this section, we'll cover several lighting setups and styles that you can use for different popular effects. Let's start by taking what you've learned about backlighting and try it with a handy type of modifier called a strip light. For this demonstration, I've placed 2 strip lights behind my subject at approximately a 45-degree angle to the camera to subject axis. This is a very common way to position a couple of strip lights. And by the way, these are Godox 14 by 63-inch strip lights, which are basically long, narrow softboxes. Each strip light is mounted to a Godox TT685 flash using an S-type flash bracket. My camera settings for this and most of the following demonstrations are ISO 100 at f8, and the shutter is 1/250th of a second. The strip lights are about 30 inches from the subject, and I've got them on full power. I have a Godox AD400 Pro with a glow 36-inch octagonal softbox as my key light, positioned about 2 feet from the subject's face. The AD400 is set to 1/8 power. Here's the result of using just the key light. Now we'll add in the strip light on camera left. Now include the strip light on camera right. These lights produce what we call a rim light or a kicker, which highlight the contours of the subject and help visually separate her from the background. Now let's bring those strip lights more in line with the subject, and you can place these really wherever you want to achieve different looks. I think this combination is interesting. We're going to remove our round softbox key light for this one, and we're using the same settings as before. The subject is turned slightly to camera right. All right, here's the left light only. Here's the light on camera right. And here's the result with both lights on. Next, let's take a look at a very popular type of portrait lighting called clamshell lighting. This is often used in beauty shots because it surrounds the face with light, reducing contrast to a minimum, which in effect reduces a good amount of detail. Clamshell lighting is similar to a standard key and fill light setup, except it's turned on its side. The key is directly above the face and the fill is directly below. Now the trick with clamshell lighting is to not allow the lower light to overpower the upper light. Here I'm using the two strip light softboxes we used earlier, but really you can use anything you'd like for the key light and fill light. In other words, you might want to use a round softbox as your upper light, the key light, and a reflector or a small softbox as the lower light. Camera settings are still ISO 100 at f8 and 1/250th of a second. Now this is with the key light only, and it's at 1/2 power. Now we add in the lower light, which again is essentially a fill light, and this is at 1/16th power. Here the lower light is at 1/4 power, 1/2 power, and here's what it looks like when the lower light is at full power. And here's a reason why we don't want to overpower the upper light. You can see we've introduced an underlighting pattern, which isn't something we usually want to see. I mean, sometimes we like this effect, but mostly we try to avoid it. Now, if you find you need a portrait with a solid white or mostly white background, you'll need to make sure you hit the background with enough light to just about blow it out or overexpose it. At the same time, you need to make sure your subject isn't receiving too much of a wraparound effect, which looks more like this, and we'll cover that in a moment. Make sure that your key light, or whatever lights you're lighting your subject with, is providing enough illumination for a correct exposure on the subject. Now I'm changing my camera settings for this shot. I'm increasing my ISO to 200 and sticking with f8 and 1/250th of a second for the shutter. This is going to help me get that background where I want it with my strip lights at 1/2 power each. They're about 2 feet from the center to where they're aimed at the wall, and the subject is about 3 feet from the wall. Here my key is the AD400 Pro with the 36-inch softbox, and I've got a good exposure on the subject at 1/8 power. Now for the wraparound effect. Here we're overpowering the normal exposure with the background lighting and not placing as much emphasis on the subject's exposure. And this is an interesting ethereal look. Again, the lights are strip lights with Godok's TT685 flash units, and both lights are at full power this time. For this shot, the camera settings are ISO 800 at f8, 1/250th of a second. And for this shot, I've opened up the aperture to f4.
Hey, thanks for watching this course, and remember to like, subscribe, and comment. If you'd like to download my free photography guides, see the link in the description, and don't forget to check out my channel for more photography tutorials.